Right, that's cool. It started. Right, everybody ready for the?
Yeah, let's let them in, Richard, and then I'll say a few words, and we'll give them another minute for other stragglers to join. So.
All right, here they come.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, I'm Rollo Hope. I head up the tech exports team in DIT. Thanks so much for joining. We're just going to wait another minute or two for any other people who haven't been as prompt as you to join, and then we will kick off. Thank you so much. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this session on what we've grandly called Demystifying China, which we'll be able to do in 60 minutes, no problem, on data and cybersecurity. My name is Rollo Hope. I head up the Technology and Smart Cities Exports team at the Department for International Trade. I've got Richard and Lucas in my team on the line as well. And I'm delighted that we are partnering with the China British Business Council, CBBC, today, and Mark Headley, who we work with very closely, one of their directors. So Mark, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce our panelists and then to get the ball rolling. So I'll pass over to you, to Mark.
There we go, good start. Thank you, Rollo. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for joining us today. Just to introduce myself, so I'm, as Rollo said, I'm the director for technology and innovation at the China Britain Business Council. Probably most people who've looked at China would probably be aware of CBBC. We're a strategic partner of DIT in China, working very closely, particularly with colleagues at Post across China, where we have 10 offices in different cities and locations. So before we kind of kick off, I thought I would just start by introducing our two speakers today. I mean, the subject of today's webinar is Demystifying China Data and Cybersecurity. We'll come on to that in a moment in terms of what that actually means and what we'll be talking about. Obviously, it's quite a big topic and quite complex area. We're quite fortunate today that we've got two experts looking at this from two very different vantage points. So I don't know if we could just go on to the next slide. Our first panelist is Mark Shaw, who's a managing partner at King and Wood Mallison's KWM law firm. So Mark spent a number of years in China, and he specializes in FDI, cross-border M&A, IP, and private equity investment in China. So Mark has worked across many sectors, but done particularly a lot of work in the technology and innovation space, working with both multinational corporations and smaller businesses. He's actually dialing in from China. He's one of the fortunates that has managed to travel outside the UK and I think for his sins he spent a good part of a month in quarantine. So we're very fortunate to have Mark join us from Shanghai today to give us his view of data and cybersecurity. Our second speaker, if we go on to the next slide, is Dr. Majid Anwar, who's CEO and founder of Modo. And Modo is a Glasgow-based scale-up company. I would say startup, but I think the company's been going for a couple of years now. Majid himself has founded a number of technology companies in the past, raising money from the VC angel sovereign fund networks. The business Modo, I mean, I'll let Majid introduce the company in a moment, but essentially it's a cloud file sharing business that is currently scaling up and growing internationally. And China's been a key market for them. So Majid's going to talk a little bit about Modo's experience of setting up in China and doing business in China as an entity, given some of the restrictions facing foreign companies around data, IP, and other sort of issues. So before we kind of get into the discussion, I think it might be worth just standing back for a moment and thinking about why we're here today, why you might have dialed into this session. I think that regardless of where you're operating internationally, I mean, many of you may well already be exporting into Europe or the US or other kind of so-called Anglosphere markets, maybe even a bit further afield. But I suspect that many of you have less experience of China as a market. And I think that many companies in our experience often almost consciously avoid the China market because it is perceived to be quite difficult in terms of IP control, the culture and the language, and just this general perception that China is a difficult market to enter. And I think that the data question is one that increasingly is coming up as something that businesses are concerned about in terms of their access to data and how they can manage that effectively. At the same time, I think that many businesses recognize that they need to have a China strategy. China is, at the end of the day, the biggest global population. It has a rising middle class, over a billion, almost a billion mobile internet users. And of course, what we've seen in the last 12 months is that China is still growing very strongly. It's predicted to grow by 8% this year alone. It was one of the few global economies that saw steady growth in 2020. And of course, those of you that have been paying attention to the news will see that China's just released its next 5-year plan, and technology is very much at the heart of that forward growth plan. So China is becoming a far more technology intensive country, and that's kind of creating some opportunities for overseas businesses. So it's almost impossible not to have some kind of China strategy. Another interesting statistic is that China's digital economy now accounts for 35 trillion renminbi, which in percentage terms is about a third of its GDP. So wherever you travel in China nowadays, digital is a very constant presence, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's digital payments, whether it's kind of online consumption of media and entertainment. And all of that has been driven by, kind of investment in 5G, significant policy measures to promote the growth of the digital sector. So all of that kind of creates quite an inviting opportunity for UK technology businesses. And actually, if you look at the stats in terms of UK-China trade, telecommunications, computer and information services represents almost 10% of UK service exports to China. And actually, the UK has a surplus in terms of service exports to China. So all of that's really interesting and exciting for British tech businesses, but there are still these questions about the how. How do we go to China? How do we overcome these regulatory barriers? And of course, for tech companies, data regulation is something that, you know, is vitally important in terms of the business model, right? So in Europe, we have GDPR. Many businesses are now familiar with GDPR. They're able to comply with it internationally. But what about China? You know, what are the restrictions in terms of how you can manage data, etc. in China? So I thought maybe sort of to kick off with Mark, who obviously KWM are working with many tech businesses to kind of address these issues. But I think the first question that I have really is around, before we come on to the question around the rules and regulations and how data can be managed and processed and stored, etc. What about access to data? How easy is it for a British tech company to actually access data in the first place, whether that's data from consumers, whether it's from businesses, whether it's from government, that many business models rely on? So maybe we can start at that point. So Mark, how easy is it for a tech business to actually get hold of data sets in China?
I think you know, really for most of our clients, you know, data has only been something which has really come up in the last 3 years, I would guess. And when it first started, I assumed we could do one 3-page memo and we could just always use that for everybody. But then I did realize, you know, data is actually quite complicated when you dig into the specific business model. So to answer your question, I think, look, 90% of the clients who raise issues about data, it doesn't cause a major issue for them. I say, you know, so if we're talking about how to access data or get data points, first issue is how they would collect it. So a lot of our you know, clients who are tech companies who are operating offshore, like you said, those British companies providing services, yeah, they will typically harvest the data offshore. So Chinese consumers will be volunteering information offshore, and then Chinese data law, yeah, it doesn't really affect you very much. Now, it's changed a bit, and I would say there is a big misconception that China has very repressive data laws. China, until about 5 years ago, had no data laws. So it was really, there was no protection. And so I think, you know, with one exception in relation to employees, if you're GDPR compliant, you're at a higher level of data protection than the Chinese regulations. But they're constantly evolving, and there's lots of different drafts. You don't need to where to go. But to your specific question, if you're collecting the data information offshore, that's not a big issue. The things where I would be careful is if you're buying, like you said, consumers, Chinese consumer information, I would check, you know, that's normally a market research company. I would check carefully whether that market research company is entitled to acquire such market research data about consumers. This is a long time ago, but Dun & Bradstreet got in a lot of trouble because they had somehow collected 6 million people's worth of personal data. So I think that personal data is a sensitive topic. So check who you're acquiring the data from. And then, of course, other data, if you're a business, but let's say you're a mining business, or you have to have a sense of what is sensitive in China. So, you know, things like geological surveys, geographic type map data, these data points may not be particularly sensitive in the West, but very sensitive in China. And so in those cases, make sure that where you're acquiring it, there's no problem with state-owned assets, because, state-owned secrets. So if it's a state secret, you have lots of trouble. Now, that only has come up in a handful of cases in the last 20 years, but one famous case was Rio Tinto. And then I'd say that the final kind of people that really have to be worried about the data would be healthcare providers. So we have a lot of digital companies who want to do, you know, offshore processing or analytics on Chinese patients. In those cases, it's very important to find the right Chinese partner. So if it's perhaps a Chinese hospital or a pharmaceutical company who knows how to handle that patient data, that's important. Perhaps the last one is actually, we have also cases of large multinationals who do common R&D projects between China and their offshore businesses. There's things to look into, but the collaboration is not really very impacted by data requirements.
Okay, you covered quite a lot of ground there, and one of the things that you suggest is that there might be certain sectors or industries which are more sensitive than others. And I've obviously thinking about the cybersecurity law. We have this concept of critical infrastructure, right? And this was initially one of the things that was quite prominent in that initial legislation, was that there was aspects of the law which were designed to protect China's national infrastructure. And I suppose in the UK we also have this emerging as a kind of policy is protecting national infrastructure. Presumably then, what does that mean for a business? So for example, if I am I don't know, perhaps I'm collecting data on the oil and gas refining industry, or I might be operating some kind of analytic service for a client in one of those kind of more sensitive industries. It could be to do with cities or mapping or something where you're relying on very sensitive data sets. What does that mean in terms of a business model for China? So does that mean that I will be restricted from operating completely, or simply means that I need to adapt the business model to comply with Chinese law? Maybe I need to put that data onto Chinese servers, for example.
So I think these are different issues. So I think the data issues, if we're talking about the data, it's for most people, it will only be if you're dealing with Chinese consumer information, like personal information, important information like health data or addresses, or if you have a lot of that kind of data, yeah, that could be an issue. What you're talking about with, if it's an oil and gas or some kind of analytics, I would be more worried that the data is somehow a state secret. So that would be a very bad thing. The cybersecurity is different, in my opinion, from data. Cybersecurity is about whether your technology is safe and secure. And it's more of a mystery that China didn't have this law in the past, rather than it introduced it. And so I think for most companies who are worried about it, it's not really a major issue unless you're a company that is seeking to be a supplier. So if you're a company that wants to supply a software solution to the Chinese banking system, you'll have to go under a security assessment. If you want to supply, like, perhaps Sinochem or CNOR, or one of these big state-owned companies, then you will probably have to undergo a security check that your product or your software, hardware or software, is safe and secure, is the term. So I think it's legitimate. People say that it's a barrier to entry. People say, well, you have to give your source code up. I don't think the Chinese are doing this to get the source code so they can hand it on to the Chinese competitors, but it's more a kind of legitimate reason that if a UK company was selling a software product to the Chinese banking system, that you couldn't just explode it. So I think, the cybersecurity, for most companies, it's not an issue. Data is an issue for most people. Whether you're a university collecting Chinese student information or you're a healthcare company doing a clinical trial in China, you could be affected. I think the cybersecurity, it's a slither of companies who are affected.
Yeah. So what we're saying is that if you're taking a product into China, into selling into a sensitive sector, critical infrastructure, etc., there will be a kind of almost like a verification process to check that technology is secure and can be placed on the network, and that's a fairly transparent process that companies go through.
I don't know if it's transparent. I mean, I think the issue there is a bit more complicated, because even before we had the cybersecurity law, if we were looking at sensitive areas through bidding requirements, like, the CIBRC, the Chinese banking regulator, they would give you a list of approved vendors. And even though there wasn't a law in place, if you hadn't passed the security assessments, you would not be on the list of approved vendors. And so, I think, so this is not a new concept. It's a bit puzzling that they didn't have it in a law previously. I would say, to say it's transparent would make it sound like it's much more detailed than it is. And I think, you would have to check for your product, who's the regulator, who will do it, and also what other little hiccups they are. But really, for people who've asked us about it, it's only been a few companies, and it's only affected a part of their business so far.
Yeah, okay. So we mentioned, I think a question just came in on this. By the way, if people have questions that are coming up, I'm sure that things are people are thinking of questions as we go through this conversation. Do feel free to put them into the chat box. So Daryl Morton has asked about data sovereignty, and you talked a little bit about offshore and onshore data. Maybe you can explain a little bit about that, because I think there is an assumption by many businesses that when they're operating in China, they have to keep data that's collected in China on Chinese servers. But you did talk a little bit about collecting data offshore. So I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what the rules are there and how they would differ depending on the product or the service that's being brought into China.
Okay, so we actually had two real examples in the last 2 years, which was a bit shocking and a bit surprising. So one client is a European Union member countries company, and so what happened there was they were a service as a software company. In their China headquarters, the National Intelligence Service and the Public Security Bureau turned up looking for access to information because certain criminal elements within China were using the software solution to do widespread criminal activities. And it was actually interesting because this was something which we were not really used to, and so we had lawyers go there to perhaps comfort the client, but they weren't really sure what they were going to do either. And so what happened in that case was the client was kind of bound by the law to share information and access to the data which was stored in China, but they also wanted to see the data which was stored in Europe. And in that case, the Chinese, the intelligence officials, they did not try to get this information directly from from our client. They have to go through international channels, and that was a bilateral arrangement between the Chinese government and that particular EU member country's protocols. And so they pursued it that way. And so, the immediate reaction from the European company was, well, we can't share it. We're not allowed to share this information without a court order in our jurisdiction. And so there was a bit of tension there, but the Chinese authorities didn't seek to get the overseas stored data because they realized they can't just require it. So they did it through their own bilateral security arrangement. And in another case, what we had was that actually a client of ours was, misbehaving, and they were doing things, here, and there was a clampdown. And in that case as well, the idea was the Chinese authorities had access to the locally stored data, but they didn't, stop us, and there were no repercussions from turning off the overseas server. And that was also a risk because, obviously the overseas client was not, involved in the criminal element. But once you have that server access open, then the whole global system was compromised. And so in that case, the decision was made to close it down, and that would also close the access to the Chinese authorities. So I think in both those cases, the Chinese authorities would get access to information held in China, but there is data sovereignty in that they will not, at least as far as we've experienced, attempt to gain access to information held outside of China.
Yeah, and it's legitimate then, from what you're saying, for example, a SaaS business or some kind of technology business that's operating in China that maybe is it isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily have a plan to kind of put an operation in China and to manage things locally. It's legitimate to collect data on businesses and or potentially consumers through its overseas, to put that data onto an overseas server. That's a legitimate business model with regards to the.
In the end, we're talking about the data, so that's why data does get very complicated. So we had another client, a medical device company, and they could only do the fine tuning of that specific device by having data about the individuals. So I don't want to say what it is, but it was something. So the product, would be adjusted overseas and then sent back. And in that case, the issue was the information was pseudonymized, but it was not anonymized. So that means you could still trace back, patient 10798. If you knew who it was, you could find out who it was. And so that was a real problem. And it is still in a bit of a gray area. And so they did continue with it, but that was not absolutely clear cut. So I think, again, if we're talking about that data, the question is, if you collect the data in China, it gets more serious the more personal it is. If there's a risk to social security, if there's national security concerns, social stability concerns, that's all worse. So if you can collect the information offshore, that's nice. But let's say, if it's, I don't know, if Tesco's had a big supermarket chain here, they couldn't just supply all their loyalty card information to Tesco's UK so they could fit it. That's difficult. And where people come a cropper sometimes is, even if you collect the information a certain way, you have to be careful who processes it, because very often the information is processed by a third party, and you have to make sure that the requirements are not stringent, but it's just about whether you tell the consumers the normal consumer things, how you're using the information, what safeguards there are, and things like that. All of that is common sense, but you should make sure it's reflected in the agreements.
Yeah. So it's it sounds very much as though if you're operating in China and you're operating a GDPR to GDPR standards within China, then you're probably already meeting that threshold that there is around data privacy.
Yeah, I think the only main difference, which is a very kind of minor one, is in relation to employment, because the Chinese regulations are just not as detailed and they're in a constant state of flux. So they are getting more privacy stringent as time goes on. And so with employees, I think GDPR has a bit of a safe harbor provision if it's got a legitimate purpose, business purpose, which China doesn't have. So, it is a little bit gray whether you could even just send your employees' personal data to the headquarters, but most clients still do it because they have to process bonuses overseas or things like that. But that's not as clear cut. But in other cases, I think really if you're GDPR compliant, you're pretty likely to be okay under the Chinese law.
Have we seen many foreign companies? I mean, you mentioned about Dun & Bradstreet at the beginning, but have we seen any other kind of big cases with foreign businesses?
But Dun & Bradstreet, that was a weird one. That would have been a long time ago. That was like 15 years ago, and it was part of a consumer strike hard campaign, which they would often do. I think that's also one of the interesting things. A lot of these new regulations come up, and people think, they're going to go after the foreigners. And actually, they're not really that interested in the foreigners. I think the people that have been hit have been the big tech companies in China. So they're seen by the Chinese government as a far bigger risk. And, anybody who's spent time in China, how many unsolicited calls do you get from people wanting to lend you money or sell you financial stuff or insurance for your car? And I think that is actually going back a bit and it's receding. So I think foreign companies are not really the main ones, but that's the issue.
Okay, great. We're getting a few questions coming in. So maybe this is from Kostas. Just quick, we might be veering away from data a little bit. But by the way, I'm going to bring Majid in a moment, maybe after we've done this question. Is there a way to operate a way to operate a server in China without having a Chinese business entity? So can you host on a Chinese server without setting up a WFI or a business structure of some kind?
I think that all the clients we have, they would have a WFI. I think when people operate offshore, so a lot of those SAS companies, they will start with an offshore only model, but then they will normally have a few dedicated Chinese distributors. And I think in those cases, to have the server, they would probably have the agreement with them. But then once they have the WFIs, so I think a lot of people get worried about the VATS licenses and things like that. And there are ways to perhaps structure it so you can avoid having the full scale kind of company. But I think the short answer is you will need somebody to cooperate with in China. So I'm pretty sure you can enter into an agreement with the overseas companies. I'm sure that they have. But I can perhaps get back. If you drop me his name, I can send you an email, because we did look at it for a client. I don't want to mislead on this, but I can get back to him on that.
Yeah, and so just for people might be getting a bit confused by the acronyms that we keep throwing in there. So the VATS license is value-added telecom services, I think, or seller, which is a specific license that applies to certain types of companies providing telecommunications, and sometimes I think SaaS businesses get caught up in this legislation.
So just very brief on that. So there's many different VATS licenses, and almost all software as a service companies will potentially fall in it. So you have to do a bit of careful thinking about your business model. And like I said, a lot do operate offshore, but it does hamstring their business development. And so once they do locate onshore, they see a big bump, because operating offshore is cumbersome, REMB restrictions and all that. But the VATS license, those value-added telco service licenses, depending on what they are, they can be either impossible to get, expensive to get, or easy to get. So that's something you have to look at, and it's very specific.
Yeah, and I think the bare minimum, the hosting companies also do require the ICP license, which is the basic for hosting something in China. So, and that does require either a local entity or a partner that you can work with to do that. So one of the things that often comes up with clients that we talk to is they assume that they can just work with their existing cloud provider, AWS or Azure, or one of the big ones. But in China, they do operate as separate companies. So the license, all those hosting companies are bound by Chinese law. So whatever Chinese law mandates, foreign businesses would need to comply with. So it means localizing normally in some way. Although obviously some companies can still sometimes do things through Hong Kong, right, or Singapore, a regional hosting hub. If it's an issue around latency for the technology that's
it's not easy. I think so. I think there's also ways that you can work with people like Ali Cloud or the Tencent Cloud, and so I think not many people do it anymore from Hong Kong or Singapore. They will find an onshore solution, and either they do it directly offshore, or I think mostly they use their distributor or some trusted partner to operate it.
Okay, well, I think that's a really good point to bring Majid in, because Majid is obviously has been through all this and has the battle scars to prove it. So, hi Majid, good morning. Do you want to just maybe tell us a bit about your story? Obviously, we've known each other for a few years now, but be good just if you can sort of share a bit more background to Modo. I know you've got a little video you're going to show as well, just to tee that up.
That might be the easiest way, Mark. Thank you. I will just bring this up on screen. It's more of a marketing video, so bear with me with the rest of the audience about how it's presented. But it gives you a little background to what Modo is about, and then I can tell you a bit more about our experiences in China. I'm just going to set that up. Hopefully this works.
We've not got the sound, actually, Majid.
I see, the sound didn't come through. Just give me 1 second, I'll try that again. It did actually start by itself, whereas normally it gives me the option to set the sound. That's better.
Too much digital stuff, created over years of work and fun. Photos and documents in lots of clouds, attached to email, and on your phone or tablet. You know it's out there, but you just can't remember where. Introducing Modo. Modo sees all your files and attachments and organizes all of it securely, giving you a live and updating visual of all your stuff, wherever you are. across all your devices. But that's not all. Modo lets you get to work on all your documents and photos. Printing, editing, annotating, and sharing, where you can search for any file by name, location, type, time, and people. Modo gives you information about your historical and live data, and it's robust enough to manage any case of digital clutter as it happens. As soon as you sign up, the magic begins, and then it's always there, right in the palm of your hand. Modo, forget about forgetting. Make stuff simpler. Sign up today.
So hopefully that gives you an idea of what Modo is about. Although it could be described as a SaaS company and a cloud company in the back end, certainly with the infrastructure, it's actually got quite a strong consumer or personal focus to it as well. In a space that we described as more personal big data. And I think that's relevant to a lot of the stuff that Mark was saying earlier about how you interface with data in China. One of our challenges was that we are dealing with members of the public, and then we found it a lot easier to have conversations with Chinese authorities about industrial things. It's still quite nascent when it comes to selling that visual experience to members of the Chinese public, where they're a lot more sensitive about how that's done. But basically what Modo does is collect data together that is provided by the users by allowing or encouraging users to sign themselves into services where they keep that data. And Modo provides a single location where a database, a very visual database, almost think of it as a picture gallery of that content, can be stored, hosted, and searched. We don't host the data itself. That stays where it is. Examples are cloud drives and mailboxes. But what Modo allows you to do is to find that material on those cloud drives and mailboxes, to search through it, browse through it, and it's continuously updating, it's live. And so by definition, it does hold personal information, or at least references that personal information in one location. Our story in China was that we were very fortunate to I have to admit, to stumble across an opportunity with Alibaba through one of their huge subsidiaries that they'd acquired, and basically found ourselves in a position to present a plugin onto the UC Web browser, which has got 600 million users across China and a small part across South Asia as well. And that was a software offering to Alibaba, in return for which, at the bottom of that plugin, we had a banner that was fixed there and inviting users who are viewing what you might call the world's most boring content on mobile. That's Office documents and PDF. Zooming in and viewing Excel spreadsheets on a tiny little device screen, but inviting them to come to Modo and find out a bit more about the rest of their content that's out there. And through that, we had over 150 million unique tracked visits to our sign-up pages. And so the pressure on us to get into China and to launch in China was huge because of the demand that we were seeing, and that's where we found ourselves.
Great, yeah. And so you then, just to kind of take that forward, then you actually decided that the best way to kind of capitalize on that opportunity was actually to set up in China. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you came to that as a decision, because obviously one of the things that we've spoken about with Mark is, do you serve the market from offshore, or is it necessary to put some kind of entity in place in China? What was it that made you decide that was the way to go, was to set up locally? And what did that look like in terms of the kind of the process and the challenges around setting up?
I think it would always have been challenging to achieve the scale that we were targeting China from outside of China. I mean, even if we were looking for several million users, I would expect to service them properly, you'd want to be inside the country. When you get to the potential, I'm not saying we sign these people up, but you get over 100 million hits, and these are uniquely tracked, so these aren't repeat hits. You get that scale coming into your company. You really do need to set up inside China. But in this specific case, it was very clear that the kind of services that we were offering, which is continuously connecting to cloud locations, couldn't be done across the Great Firewall of China. Practically speaking, it's a very active internet activity, and so that just simply wouldn't behave itself. and so it made sense to set up inside. That involved figuring out, and it's not been easy figuring out what kind of company structure we needed. We've probably been through a couple of them, or we've evolved a couple of them as we understood better what's required. Mark had earlier on mentioned the VATS license, and we are currently exploring that because we certainly feel that we would need something like that. And I totally agree with the view that it ranges from very easy, though I've not come across anyone who's had a very easy time there, to nigh on impossible to get hold of one. So we set up a structure which involved originally a WOFI in China, but quickly found that that wasn't going to be adequate, and so we have set up a full Chinese registered operation. The most effective way for us was to work through organisations like CBBC, and in our case SDI. There are various other regional organisations that can help, UK government organisations that can help. But there were also private or individual companies that work between the UK and China to help what they define as talent landing in China. In other words, if you have tech or you have business experience or any kind of profile that you can define, the Chinese local state authorities are definitely incentivized to help you land in China. That includes everything from helping you with a lot of the processes, incorporating companies, opening bank accounts, through to financing and finding office space as well. We're very fortunate, after a couple of shots of working our way through these talent programs, to get landed in Hangzhou, in the city of Hangzhou, which happens to be coincidentally the headquarters of Alibaba, so it worked for us. But it was also a good talent program that met our requirements and profile. They provided us with funding, with an office space for 3 years, as well as, and this is probably equally important, like rapidly accelerating processes like opening bank accounts, helped us incorporate the company. Pretty much they had people with their boots on the ground, but also being government, it was very easy for them to get things done. I mean, literally here, if I were to open a business bank account, as I did, it can take weeks to get done in the UK. You've got to go through and KYC yourself and visit a branch. There was a case of start in the morning, wander down to the bank downstairs, a big national bank, with a government officer in tow. The bank manager comes out to meet you personally because government is here, and the whole process is finished within about an hour and a half. And that makes the whole thing a lot easier to get done because you need that kind of help being a foreigner in China. So that's how we ended up, and where we got to was an established company inside of China, which is a largely owned subsidiary of the UK, or I should say the global UK company. And so it still is a foreign company operating in China, or a foreign-owned company operating in China.
So it's more of a sort of joint venture. So you sort of have a local Chinese stakeholder.
We do. Legally, you have to be careful. I'm not an expert here. Mark can advise us on that. But the definition of joint venture in China is slightly different than it is everywhere else. We use it locally where we see two parties getting together as a joint venture, but there are legal implications of joint ventures in China, which are subtly different than here, and I think it's a separate structure. So this isn't strictly a joint venture, but what we have set up is an additional company in China, which is wholly owned by Chinese nationals, team members or investors, which we've been able to do business with, relationships with in China. And so we were able to set that up, and that also acts as effectively our agent in China, partner in China, but it's one that's 100% friendly with us, which is the big challenge, is finding someone inside China who can be your Chinese partner that is effectively you, and that was the trick. Okay,
and then so just to come back to this question of data, how big a issue have you found that in terms of your sort of day-to-day operation? I mean, it sounds as though there's been quite a lot of complexity around, setting up, working with local government, getting everything everything put in place, deciding on the right business structure, etc., like localizing. But how important was the data issue? Because obviously, as you said, you are dealing with, although you're not collecting data, the data that your service is effectively accessing is sensitive personal files, right?
Yeah.
How big an impact do the data rules have on the business model?
Huge. I think I probably misrepresented it when I said I wasn't collecting the original files of data, but by definition, because we've created visual thumbnails and we've extracted text, searching and so on. We have got data. We've got, you know, identifiable data on that content. So certainly we are in that same category. Yes, we focused largely on getting ourselves set up. And I think, you know, there was a question that popped up about how easy it is to set up a company in China. And with the help of local lawyers and with the help of local government through these talent programs or outside, it's actually very simple. It's very straightforward. It happens very quickly. It's very easy to do. Although the laws, you have to be very careful, are quite different when it comes to accounting and reporting. We focused on that part of it, largely because we were also concerned about structure, but actually the data question is far bigger. I have to say, honestly, and hand on heart, I don't think we've completely solved the data question. And I don't think actually it's because data was the problem for us. We found our biggest challenge in China is how the laws are implemented and to some degree defined. I think perhaps we're very used in the UK to understanding how laws are defined and more importantly, how they tend to be implemented. But in China, I found it to be very vague. And even at governmental level, even government officers admit to that themselves as well. They see that as an advantage, that laws aren't black and white when they come to implementation, because they insist that that's in your favor. I find that a bit uncomfortable, I'll be honest with you, but they insist in your favor because it allows them to wave you through when it suits their purpose. And I think that's great if, of course, it works. The problem is, as with all things, if there's not a clear definition, they can also wave you back when it suits their purpose. And it's difficult to plan in business when you don't know where you stand. So that was our biggest challenge, even when it comes to cybersecurity law. I also agree, if you're complying with GDPR, you've almost certainly gone beyond what the Chinese state requires. But two things came out of this. One is that it's not very well defined as to what you specifically require. I mean, we would require a VATS, a VATS license as well, probably quite a deep one, a category 2, not telecoms one per se. And my understanding from our lawyers in China are two things. One is it's incredibly expensive to get hold of because the lawyers charge you a fortune to talk through a process with the government, and there's no guarantee you'll get it. And secondly, at least the teams that we spoke to, some fairly high-profile ones in Shanghai that partly were involved partly in the consultation of the law, said that no foreign companies they know of have managed to get the license that we're seeking, even though it's written down for 4 or 5 years now that you can have a 50% partnership in this particular space. Nobody's actually issued one of those. So we found in China there's a lot of stuff that's written down but never actually happens, and that's quite frustrating for a company like ourselves. So that's our biggest challenge, is actually how the law is practiced as opposed to what it says.
Yeah, I don't know if Mark has any thoughts about that from your vantage point. How do we deal with that kind of obliqueness of opaqueness, of some Chinese laws and regulations, potentially a minefield to pick through, I would think, for particularly maybe for SMEs that don't have the same resources to, pay for the expensive legal services like yours.
Yeah, well, nothing is more expensive than a cheap lawyer. But I think, the issue, I think like what Majid said is, look, I think a few things, to clarify. So I think Majid was talking about a Chinese-owned company with whom they cooperate. It sounded almost a bit like a captive. This is quite a common thing in this space. It's called a VIE company. And so, that's how a lot of companies overcome this. I think there's 2 points. I think the one of the problems with lawyers is also, in the West, you think, the new law is coming out on, January the 1st next year. I don't need to comply now. In China, it's like, well, the new law is coming out on 1st of January. You better start applying that now. So even if we see draft regulations, we try to work out what's the trend. And then I think, what Majid said about those VAT licenses, you have to realize it is very bespoke. So you have to look at it. You mentioned ICP license before. So Mark, you actually misspoke. ICP license, you can never get. You'll never get that. You can get an ICP filing. You can get that in 1 day. ICP filing, you don't even have to turn up. You just do it online. And so then I think if you go one step further, it will depend whether it's national or provincial. And you don't have to pay for those licenses, but you have to have a large amount of registered capital if you want the national one. And what Majid also said is very true. One of the biggest, I don't want to say scams, but one of the biggest things where people waste really years listening to lawyers is they will talk about the Shanghai Weigao Chow regulations about how you can get these VATS licenses if you set up there, but they've never issued one of those VATS licenses. So I think you've got to like actually know what you're looking at. So if you want, and the VATS licenses really are not all equal. So if you want a streaming high definition internet mapping VATS license, you will never get it. Even if you're a Chinese company, even if you have a VIE, there are only, I think, 15 of those in China, and they're very important for autonomous cars. So I think they are quite different. Some are not very hard to get, like voice over IP or something. It really depends what your business model is. And so have a look at it. And I think most people would do something similar to what Majid did, which is have a VIE model and that have that Chinese domestic company hold it. But you have to do some research because, like I say, depending on what you want to do, they might not be able to get the licenses either.
Yeah.
And what, Mark, so this might be asking a stupid question, but what drives these what would to a British business would probably seem extremely restrictive regulations? You know, what is it that drives that? I mean, is it just because, you know, the internet is censored effectively, and you know, the Chinese authorities are, you know, very reluctant to allow foreign businesses to offer, you know, for example, consumer services in a very, you know, tightly controlled market? Or what is it? Protectionism? What is it that kind of, what is it that drives those strict rules and regulations?
Well, I think, yeah, there's always a hang up, you know, like streaming video, anything that could be like a news outlet, publishing, so that's sensitive. Anything that's a social media thing, that's very sensitive.
I think we just lost him.
Oh, we've lost Mark. Oh, how tragic. Well, hopefully he will come back.
It is about whether you're going to have a social or disruptive impact. So the likes of what Modo does at the moment is focusing on really personal data. So you're not sharing with other people. It's your own content. It's already been authorized. It's already probably being watched and filtered or curated by whatever authorities have provided those services. Mark's absolutely right. It's really about sharing and social disruptive stuff where it becomes communication or media. There's messaging in there. Then the state looks very, very carefully at what's going on there.
Yeah. Sorry, we lost you for a moment there, Mark.
Yeah. So I think that's exactly what Majid said. The only other one is that ICP license. So if you want to do e-commerce for your own product, so go ahead, no problem. You can, like, you know, sell pizzas or whatever. But if you want to be like Alibaba and you're selling other people's product and you're in the middle, that's why you need that license. So I think everything makes sense what they're doing, because, you know, otherwise there could be big consumer frauds. Who's liable for the product? Who gets paid and all these things? So I think, you know, you have to really look at what you're doing and what is the risk, and that kind of defines why things are sensitive or not.
I would say, thank you, Mark. I would agree with that and say that the majority of businesses wanting to operate in China probably don't have the kind of challenges we came across, because we're putting something across which is dealing with the digital economy, which China is pushing and promoting, which is why we were invited there in the first place. We're not one of the big tech companies, so we're not seen as a threat yet in any way, so we can fly under the radar. But the majority of companies operating there have got a product or service which is very clear and is probably very welcome in China as well. So probably a lot easier to tunnel through and to define what they do and get the relevant licenses and permissions to do what they sell. In my experience, I'm having met a lot of companies on that journey. The majority of them were absolutely fine what they were operating in, and we had some odd requirements.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a bit conscious of time, and I think we should allow people a opportunity to ask any questions. So if people do have questions, raise your hand. You can use the type box. You can also come in if anyone wants to ask a specific question. Maybe it's specific to your business. We, of course, this is the first session that we've done on China for a while, and it may well be that there are other areas that people are interested in for future sessions. So any feedback as well on topics. We haven't really talked about intellectual property, which I think is an entire session in itself, but it does relate to data in terms of, I suppose, if you're if you're sharing data with Chinese partners or you're putting data in China, the ownership of the IP that surrounds that data is also a question, I would imagine, for many businesses.
Sarah's got her hand up.
Yeah, okay, I didn't see that. Yeah, Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you so much. We have launched a platform in China, and we had to change business partners in November for a variety of reasons. The new trading partner, to make matters easy for transfer of funds, has decided to set up and register a new company. They started that process in November, and the company registration number for the Chinese partner still hasn't come through. Does it typically take that length of time for a company to be registered in China?
Is that for me, Mark, or?
Well, I can give you my personal experience, not having registered greatly many of them, but 2 or 3. I'm surprised it's taken that long. Literally it normally takes 2 to 3 weeks. We got ours done in less than a week because we've government assistance. In fact, we've done within days. So I would think that's unusual. If it's to do with financial transactions or if any way it's seen as moving money between nations or inside or outside China, I think there's a completely separate set of checks. Particularly, they want to see whether it's an investment vehicle, what exactly it's transacting in. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's taking longer if in some way it's been understood to be a financial instrument or vehicle of some kind. That may be the only explanation I can think of.
Thank you.
So Sarah, sorry, can I just ask a question? So did you say that the Chinese partner wants to establish a Chinese domestically owned company? Is that what you said?
Yeah, they're doing it because they're a large entity and they want to ring fence the funds so it's easy for accounting purposes.
Yeah, they should be able to do it almost automatically within a week.
Right.
So if it was a foreign company, if you wanted to set it up, it could be difficult at the moment because in the UK you can't get documents legalized at the Chinese embassy. But if it's a domestic company, you can normally do it in an afternoon.
Right. Thank you. That's really helpful. I'll go back and challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was going to be my thoughts about it. Actually, was just that with foreign companies setting up, it tends to be often there are these different parallel processes, right? So setting up the bank account and setting it, doing the business registration, etc., and many of those processes can get tripped up just by documentary issues with the time difference and so on. So that's why what looks like 2-3 weeks on paper can take 2-3 months because of just the to and fro. But it doesn't sound like that's the case in this instance. I don't see any other
We've
questions.
got another question in the chat bar.
Okay, yeah.
A chap somebody called Costas, maybe veering away from data a little bit. Is there a way to operate a server in China without having a Chinese business entity?
You wouldn't be able to do any business in China if you haven't got an entity there. So, it's to operate a server, you would definitely need to have a Chinese entity. To operate a business in China, you could say.
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on that before, didn't we? When we got into the debate about VATs and ICCP licenses. There is one other question that's come through. Is there any central and trusted resources about regulations, licenses, ways of doing things, steps of establishing a presence in Shenzhen or Hainan, so the south of China, that we can refer to? I can maybe just, with regards to some of these things, CBBC does have some resources that we can share with you, specifically about Shenzhen and Hainan. It's probably a case of, I don't know, with you, Majid, in Hangzhou, I would imagine that when you set up, the Hangzhou government provided you with some advice and information about, the setup process and incentives and all that kind of stuff. So I suspect for Shenzhen and Hainan, it might be worth engaging with the local government. And in fact, Shenzhen does have a representative office in London. So it may well be worth speaking to Invest Shenzhen about the specific sort of regulations in Shenzhen. Mark, I'm sure that you've also got, I know that you've got some really good information that about the data laws in China that you've been circulating. So, and potentially we can also circulate some slides after this, right, from other recent events that you've done. Okay. Well, we're 10 o'clock on the dot, so I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. We do have a couple of, Lucas, I don't know if you want to just bring the slides back up again. So actually this week's quite a busy week for events on China. So there's a couple of other events that are coming up this week. Those companies that are London based might be interested to join the session on Thursday morning on doing business in China, where to start. So that's London and Partners, the Mayor's International Business Programme, have organised a session. It's a more general session on China with a number of China experts. There's also a Tech London Advocate China group, which is running a session on e-commerce and retail tech in China that might be worth joining for those of you that are interested in that sector. That's also on the 18th, but that's an evening one, so that kicks off at 6 p.m. CBBC also organises a UK-China Tech Forum. We normally do one event per quarter. The next session is on the 25th of March, and in that session we're focusing on the 14th five-year plan and what it means for the tech sector. Obviously, tech and innovation is sort of quite central to that policy. So we have a speaker. Some of you may be familiar with Gordon Orr, formerly with McKinsey, and also we have someone from Chatham House joining that session. So definitely want to join if you're available. I've just put, I think we're going to circulate the slides, but there's a link on there to our calendar page which lists all those events if you just click that link. And then the final slide is just some links to other useful resources. So there has been a campaign recently that supporting tech companies looking to go to China. So the UK government actually launched a website. So that's the website on the right hand side. So if you Google Digital and Tech China, you'll find that website, and it provides guidance for businesses on the opportunities and the risks, whether you're looking to set up in China, invest, export, or work with investors across a whole range of areas, from due diligence through to sort of risks around partnering with Chinese businesses. There was also a media campaign in The Week magazine that CBBC and Tech UK partnered on together. Worth checking that out as well. There's a lot of articles on there about different aspects of doing business in China, and there was 3 podcasts as well, half-hour podcasts that are worth checking out. And I would also encourage you to sign up for the DIT's Tech and Smart Cities newsletter, which I think goes out every couple of weeks. And you can do that by emailing the team at techexports@trade.gov.uk. So I know that people are having hard steps. We'll bring that to a close. I don't know if there's anything else from the DIT team, but I'd just like to thank Mark and Majid for joining this morning. It's been a really useful session, I think. If anyone has any further questions, please do email us directly, and we'd be happy to follow up and come back to you around any questions that you have. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your days. Bye-bye.